In a quiet town where change comes slowly and silence speaks louder than words, one man's quiet morning sets off a ripple that no one could have anticipated. Charlie Thompson, a black veteran who has spent a lifetime carrying both dignity and unseen burdens, walks into a diner one morning to wait for his son. A simple act, one that should have been unremarkable, becomes the spark of something much larger when he crosses paths with Officer Ryan Bennett, a man who believes his badge gives him power beyond accountability. What begins as a moment of casual hostility quickly escalates into an abuse of authority, leaving Charlie humiliated, handcuffed, and forced to endure the kind of injustice he's seen too many times before. But this time, something is different. Witnesses like Lydia, a waitress with quiet courage, and James, a veteran with his own scars, refused to let what happened be forgotten. And David, Charlie's son and a respected police captain, is determined to hold the system and himself to a higher standard. In a place where too many people have learned to look the other way, voices begin to rise. Conversations that were once whispers grow louder, friendships form, truths are spoken. And through it all, Charlie stands steady, embodying a strength that comes not from anger, but from resilience. The wind was sharp that morning as Charlie Thompson buttoned up his olive green coat, tugging the frayed collar snug around his neck. He looked out the small, foggy window of his one-bedroom apartment. Outside, the leaves tumbled across the narrow street, the sound of the occasional passing car echoing softly through the empty silence. It was always quiet in this part of town, a neighborhood of aging buildings and forgotten people like him. Charlie's apartment was clean but worn, much like himself. A small table by the window held a single framed photo, a black and white picture of him, younger and strong, dressed in his army uniform. The picture was of a man who had seen war, but still believed in a country worth fighting for. Next to the photo sat a cup of yesterday's cold coffee and a stack of unopened letters. Most were bills, but Charlie had grown accustomed to living with just enough to get by. He always found a way. He checked his watch, an old piece with a cracked face but steady hands. 8:15 a.m. He smiled faintly. His son, David, would meet him soon for breakfast. It was a simple thing, a father and son sharing a meal, but moments like these were precious to Charlie. They reminded him that no matter how hard life pressed down on him, he had raised a good man. Charlie shrugged on his coat and stepped outside. The air was colder than it had been in weeks, the kind that bites through clothing and settles into your bones. He made his way toward the diner a few blocks away, his boots echoing softly on the cracked sidewalk. The streets were mostly empty this time of morning. Shops were just opening, and most people were still warming their homes with coffee and newsprint. When he reached the diner, he paused to glance at its old red sign, faded and chipped. It was one of those places where time seemed to stand still, a throwback to another era, with checkered floors, chrome counters, and worn leather booths. Charlie pulled open the door, and a bell chimed above him. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the smell of bacon and coffee. A few people sat scattered throughout the room. An elderly man read his paper by the counter, and a young couple whispered quietly in a booth by the window. Behind the counter, Lydia Adams, the waitress, leaned against the soda machine, flipping through a newspaper. She was a thin woman in her 40s with tired eyes and hair pulled into a neat ponytail. Charlie gave her a small nod and found a table in the far corner by the window. It was quiet there, where he could watch the world outside and wait for David in peace. He took off his coat and folded it neatly over the back of the chair. The cold still lingered in his hands, so he rubbed them together to bring back some warmth. Lydia eventually came over, pad in hand, her voice neutral. "Morning, what can I get you?" "Just coffee, please," Charlie replied, his voice soft but steady. He offered her a polite smile, the kind that said he did not want any trouble. Lydia nodded. "Be right back." Charlie settled back in his chair, watching the steam rise from the coffee pot Lydia carried back to the counter. He glanced at his watch again. David was running late, but Charlie did not mind. Waiting was something he had gotten good at over the years. Then the door chime rang again. Charlie turned slightly to see a man step inside. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp features and a permanent scowl carved into his face. His boots struck heavy against the linoleum floor as he walked, his uniform immediately recognizable: Officer Ryan Bennett, a police officer whose reputation traveled further than his footsteps. Charlie kept his eyes forward, staring at his empty table. He had met men like Bennett before, men with something to prove, men who carried their authority like a weapon. Still, he hoped the officer would ignore him. But Bennett's gaze swept across the diner, landing squarely on Charlie. The officer's boots thudded closer, stopping right next to Charlie's table. Bennett crossed his arms, his shadow falling over Charlie's hands like a storm cloud. "You lost?" Bennett asked. His voice carried an edge, sharp enough to cut. Charlie looked up slowly, his expression calm. "Just waiting for my son, officer," he replied evenly. Bennett let out a short, dismissive snort. "Your son, huh?" He glanced around the diner as if expecting someone to appear. "Don't see too many folks like you around here. How long you plan on waiting?" "As long as it takes," Charlie replied quietly. He wrapped his hands around the empty coffee mug, finding some comfort in its familiar weight. Bennett shifted closer, his voice dropping low. "People get nervous when strangers loiter. You ought to move along." Charlie's jaw tightened, but he stayed composed. "I'm not here to bother anyone, just having coffee." Bennett's lips curled into a smirk, his tone turning condescending. "How about some ID?" Charlie looked at him, his eyes steady. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his worn veteran ID card. He handed it to Bennett without a word, watching as the officer snatched it, barely glancing at the photo, before tossing it back onto the table. "A vet, huh?" Bennett sneered. "You think carrying some old ID makes you belong here?" Charlie held his tongue, his grip on the mug tightening ever so slightly. "I know who I am." Bennett laughed bitterly, loud enough to turn a few heads. "Yeah, you all do. Always got a story, acting like you're somebody important." Charlie's patience wavered for just a moment, but he refused to let Bennett see it. "You got a problem with me, officer?" The smirk vanished from Bennett's face, replaced by something colder. He leaned in close, his voice a harsh whisper. "My problem is people like you thinking you can walk in anywhere you please, like you're entitled to respect." "I earned that respect," Charlie said firmly, "just like anyone else." Bennett's face twisted with disdain, his temper bubbling just beneath the surface. Without warning, he reached out and flicked Charlie's coffee mug. The mug tipped over, spilling cold liquid across the table and onto Charlie's coat. For a moment, the diner fell silent. All eyes turned toward them. Lydia froze behind the counter, her face pale, as the old man by the counter lowered his newspaper. Charlie drew in a slow breath, steadying himself. He stared up at Bennett, his expression calm but unwavering. "You done, officer?" Bennett's eyes flashed, his voice rising. "I said it's time you leave. Now." Charlie held his ground, his voice low but resolute. "I'm waiting for my son. I'm not moving." Bennett's patience snapped. "That's it? You think you can talk back to me?" He grabbed Charlie's shoulder roughly, yanking him to his feet. "Let's see how brave you are in a cell." "Hey!" Lydia's voice broke through the tension. She was standing behind the counter, her hands gripping the edge as if to steady herself. Her voice wavered, but she pushed through. "He wasn't doing anything wrong." Bennett shot her a look that could have stopped a clock. "Stay out of it, Lydia. This doesn't concern you." Charlie turned his head slightly, just enough to meet Lydia's eyes. There was an apology there, a quiet kindness in her gaze that surprised him. Bennett shoved him forward, his handcuffs clicking harshly around Charlie's wrists. Charlie stumbled but kept his head high, refusing to let the officer see him falter. As they stepped outside, Charlie caught one last glimpse of Lydia through the diner window. She was watching him, her expression troubled. Before he was out of view, she hurried over to the table he had left behind. The sound of Bennett's voice, barking orders as he pushed Charlie toward the squad car, faded behind him. But that small flicker of kindness, Lydia's voice calling out, her defiance against someone like Bennett, stayed with Charlie. It was the first spark of something he had not felt in a long time. Hope. The cold metal bench in the holding cell offered no comfort. Charlie Thompson, sat quietly, his back straight, his hands resting on his lap. His wrist stung where the handcuffs had been too tight, leaving faint red marks against his dark skin. He ignored the ache. It was nothing compared to the weight pressing on his chest, the kind of weight that came not from physical pain, but from old, familiar hurt. The walls around him were bare concrete, painted a sickly shade of gray that seemed to absorb any light that dared to enter. A single barred window let in a sliver of morning sunlight, but the room still felt suffocating. A clock on the far wall ticked loudly, a cruel reminder of time moving far too slowly. Charlie closed his eyes for a moment and let out a long breath. This was not his first time sitting in a cold room, surrounded by walls that felt more like barriers than protection. Memories of decades past flickered through his mind, waiting rooms, war camps, quiet nights, huddled in trenches where the only sounds were the distant rumble of artillery fire and the whispered prayers of scared young men. Keep your head down, he had told himself back then. Do not let them see you break. The lesson had carried him through years of military service, through prejudice, through every obstacle thrown his way. Now, sitting in that cell, he repeated those words silently like a mantra, holding on to his pride and dignity. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, breaking through the silence. A sharp, authoritative voice followed. Even before the words reached his ears, Charlie recognized the voice. His son. What the hell is going on here? Charlie opened his eyes and looked toward the cell door. Through the narrow window in the steel door, he saw David Thompson, his son, a man who carried the weight of responsibility in his stance. David's tall frame was clad in his sharp navy blue police captain's uniform, the badge gleaming faintly in the dim light. His brow was furrowed, his jaw tight, and his voice carried a tone that could silence a room. David had always been a man of purpose. He walked into rooms with confidence, his eyes sharp, his words measured. Charlie had seen it in him since he was a boy, the drive to do what was right, no matter how hard it was. It was a trait he had inherited from his father, though David often argued he had learned it from watching the world. Charlie's chest swelled with pride, even as he watched his son's fury simmer. The hallway outside the cell filled with murmurs and tension as David's voice rose. You arrested an elderly man? A veteran? My father? For what, having a cup of coffee? Through the window, Charlie saw Officer Ryan Bennett leaning lazily against the wall near the front desk, his arms crossed, that same smug smirk on his face. With all due respect, Captain Thompson, Bennett replied, his voice laced with false calm. He was loitering. He refused to leave when I told him to. David turned sharply, his face inches from Bennett's. You put a 70-year-old man in cuffs. You humiliated him and threw him in a cell for sitting in a diner. You call that policing? Bennett's smirk faltered just slightly. He was being difficult. David's voice dropped, dangerously low. What you did was harassment. Do you even know who you put in that cell? Do you know what kind of man he is? Bennett looked away, his face hardening. Doesn't matter who he is. Rules are rules. David's fist tightened at his side, but he held himself back. His voice remained calm, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed his anger. You and I are going to have a very long conversation about the rules when this is over. But right now, you are going to unlock that cell. Immediately. Bennett hesitated for half a breath, his ego warring with David's authority, but he finally moved toward the cell door. The metallic rattle of keys filled the air, followed by the heavy click of the lock being turned. The door creaked open, and Bennett stepped back. David entered the cell, his expression softening as he looked at his father. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The only sound was the echo of the cell door swinging shut behind them. "Dad," David said finally, his voice quieter now, thick with a mixture of anger and regret. "Are you okay?" Charlie nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "I am fine, son." David let out a breath he had been holding, his eyes scanning the room as if taking in the indignity of where his father had been forced to sit. "This should not have happened," he muttered, more to himself than to Charlie. "None of this should have happened." Charlie studied his son's face, the deep lines of worry etched into his brow. "It is not on you, David." "It is," David replied firmly, meeting his father's eyes. "I wear this badge. I lead this department. Men like Bennett, this kind of behavior, I will not stand for it." Charlie reached out, resting a weathered hand on his son's shoulder. The weight of the gesture, the calm strength in it, made David pause. "You cannot fix everything, son. The world has always been this way. You do what you can." David shook his head, his voice tight. "You taught me to do what is right, to stand up when something is wrong. I will not let this slide." Charlie allowed a faint smile, pride flickering in his chest. "You are a good man, David. You always were." David swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice. "Let us get you out of here." Together, they stepped out of the cell. Bennett had returned to the front desk, watching them with wary eyes. David shot him a look that spoke volumes, one that promised consequences. "Do not speak," David said to Bennett as they passed. Charlie followed his son out of the station, the harsh fluorescent lights giving way to the soft morning sunlight streaming through the glass doors. The air outside was cool, carrying with it a crispness that felt almost cleansing. Charlie took a deep breath, grateful to be free of the cell, though the weight of what had happened lingered in his chest. As they walked to David's car, David broke the silence. "I am going to file a formal report. He will not get away with this." Charlie turned his gaze toward his son, his voice calm but firm. "Do what you think is right. Just do not let anger lead you." David glanced at him, his expression conflicted. He stopped, searching for the words. "I hate that this happened to you, Dad. You deserve better." Charlie gave a small nod. "It is not the first time, son, but maybe it will be the last time someone thinks they can get away with it." David started the car, the engine rumbling to life. As they pulled away from the station, Charlie turned his gaze out the window. The town rolled past him, small houses, quiet streets, a place that seemed peaceful on the surface. Yet beneath it all, there were fractures, cracks that revealed the truth. He thought of Lydia, the waitress who had spoken up, even if only briefly. It was a small act, but in a moment of ugliness, it had been a flicker of light. Sometimes, Charlie thought, that was all it took, one small voice willing to speak against the darkness. David's voice broke through his thoughts. "I am taking you home. Get some rest, okay?" Charlie nodded but said nothing. Rest would come later. For now, he held on to the image of Lydia and that tiny moment of kindness. The car ride back to Charlie's apartment was quiet. David gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale against the leather, his jaw tense with unspoken frustration. The air between father and son hung heavy with all the words David wanted to say but couldn't find the right way to express. Charlie sat in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed out the window. The streets passed slowly, small houses, rusted mailboxes, and cracked sidewalks, all dusted with the light frost of the early morning. The world seemed unchanged, despite the storm that had churned inside the police station just minutes before. "You don't have to drive me," Charlie said quietly. breaking the silence as David turned onto his street. David's eyes stayed forward, his tone clipped. "I'm driving you." Charlie nodded, his lips curling faintly. There was no sense arguing with David when he was like this, hurt, angry, and too stubborn to back down. Charlie recognized that fire. He had seen it in himself when he was young, determined to make his mark on a world that too often refused to see him as anything but what they assumed him to be. The car came to a stop in front of Charlie's apartment building. It was an old, narrow building, the bricks faded and chipped in places. The stairs leading up to the front door sagged slightly, the wood creaking underfoot if you didn't step just right. It wasn't much, but it was home. David put the car in park and turned toward his father, his voice softer now. "Are you sure you're okay, Dad?" Charlie turned to meet his son's gaze. David looked so much like his mother sometimes, the same sharp eyes, the same furrow in his brow when he worried. "I'm fine," Charlie said with a small, reassuring smile. "You know me, son. I'm made of tougher stuff than that." David shook his head, his frustration bubbling back to the surface. "You shouldn't have to be. What Bennett did, it's not right." "No, it's not," Charlie agreed. "But being angry won't change what's already happened. You just focus on doing your job, David. That's what matters." David sighed, running a hand through his short hair. "I'm going to make sure there's an investigation. Bennett can't get away with this." Charlie's smile faded as he studied his son. He could see the weight David carried, an officer trying to hold others accountable, while feeling the eyes of his peers watching, waiting for him to fail. "You can't fix everything," Charlie said softly. "Just do what you can, and let the rest go." David didn't respond right away, his hands still gripping the steering wheel as if it might keep his anger at bay. Finally, he nodded. "I'll call you later, okay?" Charlie opened the car door and stepped out, pulling his coat close against the chill. "Take care of yourself, son." David watched as Charlie made his way up the steps to his apartment. He waited until the door closed behind him before driving away, the hum of the engine fading into the distance. Inside his apartment, Charlie hung up his coat and sat down at the small kitchen table by the window. The morning light cast soft shadows on the walls, the quiet pressing in around him. He reached for the napkin he had tucked into his coat pocket earlier, the one Lydia had left on the diner table just before Officer Bennett dragged him out. The note was small, hurriedly written in a neat hand. "I'm sorry. You didn't deserve that." Charlie stared at the words for a long moment, his chest tightening. In a world that often showed its worst side, this tiny gesture of kindness stood out like a lantern in the dark. Someone had seen him, really seen him, not as a stranger who didn't belong, but as a man who deserved respect. It wasn't much, but it mattered. That afternoon, word of what had happened at the diner began to spread. Small towns had a way of turning even the quietest events into whispers that rolled like ripples across the surface of a still pond. Lydia Adams stood behind the counter at the diner, wiping down coffee cups with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking. She couldn't get the image of Charlie out of her mind, his calm, steady face as Bennett humiliated him, the way he stood tall, even as he was dragged out in handcuffs. She had wanted to say more, to do something more than just whisper, "I'm sorry," when it was already too late. Guilt settled in her chest like a stone. The doorbell chimed, and Lydia looked up to see James O'Connor enter. He was a regular and old-timer who came in every morning for his black coffee and scrambled eggs. James was in his early 70s, a white man with a gruff exterior, the kind of man whose presence always filled a room. He had served in Vietnam, and though he never talked about it, people knew. "Morning, Lydia," James said, settling onto his usual stool at the counter. Lydia forced a smile and poured him a cup of coffee. "Morning, James." James glanced around the diner, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Heard there was some trouble here this morning." Lydia paused, her hand trembling slightly as she set the coffee pot back on the warmer. "There was," she admitted softly. James looked at her, waiting. Lydia hesitated. But the words tumbled out anyway. An older man, black, just sitting there, waiting for his son. Officer Bennett came in and… She stopped, shaking her head as if trying to clear the memory. It wasn't right, James. It wasn't right at all. James frowned, his weathered face hardening. What did he does? Lydia looked up, meeting James's gaze. Nothing. He did nothing, James. Bennett just didn't want him here. For a long moment, James said nothing. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his mind working behind those sharp eyes. Finally, he set the cup down with a deliberate clink. Man served? James asked quietly. Lydia nodded. Yeah, he showed his ID, a veteran, same as you. James's jaw tightened. Where's he lives? Lydia blinked, surprised. Why? Because I want to talk to him, James said firmly. Man doesn't deserve to be treated like that, and if nobody else is going to do something about it, I will. Lydia looked at him for a long moment before scribbling Charlie's address on a piece of paper. I don't know if he'll want company, she said. James slid the paper into his pocket and stood, leaving a $20 bill on the counter. He doesn't have to want it. Sometimes people just need to know they aren't alone. That evening, Charlie sat on his porch, a cup of tea cooling between his hands. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and purple, the sun sinking slowly beyond the rooftops. It had been a long day, and the quiet of the evening was a balm on his tired soul. He didn't hear James approach until the old man was halfway up the steps. Charlie looked up, surprised to see the stranger standing there, a quiet determination in his posture. Evening, James said gruffly, tipping his head. Charlie set down his cup. Evening. James shifted awkwardly, hands in his pockets. Name's James O'Connor. Heard what happened this morning. Charlie studied him for a moment, wary but polite. Did you now? James nodded. Yeah, Lydia told me, said you served. Charlie's eyes narrowed slightly, but he gave a small nod. I did. Me too, James replied. Vietnam. Charlie looked at him for a long moment, something in his expression softening. Korea. James stepped closer, his voice quieter now. I came to say I'm sorry for what happened, and to tell you you didn't deserve that. None of it. Charlie's chest tightened as he looked at the man in front of him. James's eyes were honest, his words carrying the weight of someone who understood, who knew what it was like to come home from war only to fight a different kind of battle. Thank you, Charlie said softly. James nodded, sitting down on the step beside him. The two men sat in silence, the evening air cool against their skin. For the first time in a long while, Charlie felt something he hadn't expected. He felt seen. The morning after the incident at the diner dawned gray and cold. A thin mist hung low over the street, clinging to rooftops and bare tree branches like a shroud. Inside his small apartment, Charlie sat at the kitchen table, staring at the folded note Lydia had written. Her words, simple and hurried. I'm sorry, you didn't deserve that. Stayed with him. It was a strange thing. Kindness. Unexpected, fleeting, but powerful enough to make a man pause. Charlie sipped his coffee, the heat doing little to ease the chill that seemed to have settled deep in his bones. His mind wandered to David, his son with a stubborn fire in his heart, a man who had grown into someone Charlie was deeply proud of. David's anger yesterday had been justified, but Charlie worried for him. Standing up against men like Bennett came with its own cost, and Charlie knew his son would face scrutiny within his department for holding another officer accountable. With a quiet sigh, Charlie rose from the table, rinsed his mug, and shuffled to the living room. The apartment was small but clean, a couch worn smooth by years of use, a small TV that rarely got turned on, and shelves lined with books he had read too many times to count. A framed American flag sat on the mantel, a memento from his military days. Beside it, his late wife's picture smiled at him, a bittersweet reminder of a life he sometimes felt slipping further into memory. A sudden knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. Charlie frowned, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was still early, too early for most visitors. He moved slowly, his knees stiff, before opening the door. Standing on the porch was James O'Connor, his weathered face set with quiet determination. He held a small paper bag in one hand and a thermos in the other, his eyes steady but unsure, as though he had debated coming here at all. "Morning," James said, tipping his head slightly. Charlie's brow furrowed as he looked the man over. He recognized him now, one of the regulars from the diner. "Morning," Charlie replied cautiously. "Something I can do for you?" James shifted his weight, holding up the bag. "Brought breakfast? Figured a man shouldn't eat alone after the kind of day you had yesterday." Charlie blinked, taken aback. "You brought me breakfast?" "Yeah," James said gruffly. "Scrambled eggs and toast. Figured it wouldn't hurt to share some coffee, too. It's black, same as what you had at the diner." For a long moment, Charlie stared at him, unsure what to say. Kindness like this, from a stranger, was something he didn't encounter often. After years of being treated like a man who didn't belong, he had grown used to keeping people at arm's length. But there was something in James's expression, earnest and awkward, that made Charlie step aside. "Come on in," Charlie said finally. James nodded, muttering a quiet "thanks" as he stepped into the apartment. The two men sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from their mugs as they sipped coffee in silence. James unpacked the paper bag, pushing a takeout container toward Charlie. The eggs were still warm, the toast slightly overdone, but it smelled good. Charlie gave a small nod of appreciation as he picked up his fork. "You didn't have to do this," Charlie said after a few bites, his voice quiet. James shrugged, cradling his mug in his hands. "I know." He glanced around the small kitchen before looking back at Charlie. "I heard what happened yesterday. Lydia told me." Charlie's fork paused for just a second before he set it down gently. "Did she?" James nodded. "Yeah, said Officer Bennett gave you hell for no reason. Said he dragged you out of there like you didn't deserve to sit in that chair." Charlie's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. James sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I wanted to come by because it bothered me. I've sat in that diner with you more than once. Never spoke to you, but I watched you. You don't bother anyone. You're just there, having your coffee, minding your business. The way it should be." Charlie studied him carefully, waiting for him to continue. James hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Men like Bennett officers who think the badge makes them better than everyone else. They've got no business in a uniform. I don't care what color your skin is or where you come from. You served your country. Same as me. That deserves respect." Charlie let out a slow breath, his expression softening slightly. "Korea," he said quietly. "That's where I served." James nodded, his face thoughtful. "Vietnam for me. Came back to a country that didn't much care for us either." He paused, his gaze distant. "I guess what I'm saying is, I know how it feels to walk into a room and not belong. And I'm sorry for what happened to you yesterday. It shouldn't have gone down like that." The quiet words settled in the air between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Charlie looked at the man across the table and saw something familiar, someone who carried his own scars, who had walked through fire and come out the other side with enough wisdom to know better. "You didn't have to come here," Charlie said finally, "but I'm glad you did." James nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Well, maybe next time you'll have coffee with me at the diner. You shouldn't have to sit alone." Charlie looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Maybe I will." When James left later that morning, Charlie stood by the window, watching him walk down the street, hands shoved in his coat pockets. The man's visit had been unexpected, but it left a mark. It had been years since someone outside of his family had reached out like that, offered him kindness without expectation. Charlie turned the small note Lydia had written over in his hands. "You didn't deserve that." For so long, Charlie had carried the weight of being ignored, dismissed, or looked at with disdain. He had grown accustomed to the silent tension that filled rooms when he entered them, to the whispers and sideways glances that followed. But now, for the first time in years, someone had spoken up for him, not just Lydia, but James too. He thought of the diner, of Bennett's cold sneer and the weight of the handcuffs on his wrists, and then he thought of Lydia's voice, soft, uncertain, but brave, and James's words over coffee. "You shouldn't have to sit alone." Maybe things could change, Charlie thought. Maybe people could learn to see each other not for their differences, but for their shared humanity. It was a small hope, fragile and tentative, but it was there. Charlie looked out the window, where the mist was starting to lift, the sun breaking through in golden streaks across the rooftops. He didn't know what would come next, if Bennett would face consequences, if David's investigation would shake anything loose, but for the first time in a long while, Charlie didn't feel quite so alone. The diner felt different the next morning. Charlie wasn't there, but his absence was noticeable. The air was thick with a quiet tension, as if the walls themselves held on to yesterday's events. Lydia Adams moved behind the counter, wiping it down for the third time, even though it was already clean. Her hands were restless, her thoughts unsettled. She had replayed the moment over and over again, Officer Bennett's cold sneer, the way he spilled Charlie's coffee, the handcuffs clicking too tightly around his wrists. "You didn't deserve that." It was all she could manage to say, but now it felt like too little, too late. The doorbell chimed, pulling her out of her thoughts. James O'Connor stepped inside, his boots heavy against the checkered floor. He nodded to Lydia, who offered him a faint smile, before settling onto his usual stool. "Morning," Lydia said softly, pouring him a cup of coffee. "Morning." James took a sip, his gaze fixed on the empty corner table where Charlie had sat just the day before. After a long pause, he spoke. "Haven't seen him this morning." Lydia shook her head. "No, I don't think he'll be back any time soon." James frowned, setting his cup down. "That's a damn shame. That man has more dignity in his little finger than most folks in this town." Lydia leaned on the counter, her voice low. "James, what can we do? I mean, what happened yesterday? It's not the first time someone's been treated like that, but it feels like enough is enough." James finished for her. She nodded. James exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "It starts with people saying something, Lydia. Speaking up. That's how things change." Lydia bit her lip, glancing around the diner. A couple of regulars were seated by the windows, talking quietly, but they weren't paying much attention. "You think anyone'll listen?" James's gaze was steady. "They'll listen if enough of us start talking." Lydia hesitated, but then something in her shifted. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was the way Charlie had looked at her as Bennett dragged him out, a man too tired to be angry, too strong to break. "I'll tell people what happened," Lydia said, her voice firmer now. "Someone needs to know." James gave her a small, approving nod. "Good. I'll do the same." By the afternoon, the story of what had happened to Charlie had spread further than either of them anticipated. Small towns were like that. Whispers carried quickly from porch to porch, diner booths to grocery store aisles. At the hardware store, Tom Simmons, a retired factory worker, leaned against the counter and listened as James recounted what he had seen and heard. Tom had known Charlie in passing. He had seen him around town, always quiet, always polite. Hearing how he had been treated lit a fire in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. "That's not right," Tom said, shaking his head. "Man's a veteran, for God's sake. He's earned his place here." "Then say something, Tom," James said, his tone calm but pointed. "The more of us who speak up, the harder it is for folks like Bennett to pretend they didn't do anything wrong. Tom nodded slowly, resolve settling into his expression. I'll tell my friends. They'll listen. By the time the sun started to dip below the horizon, small pockets of conversation buzzed across town. At the corner grocery store, two women stood by the canned goods, whispering about what happened to that older man from the diner. At the barber shop, a group of men sat in silence as someone muttered, "That officer's been out of line for years, and no one's done a damn thing about it." It wasn't loud, and it wasn't sudden, but it was enough. For the first time, people were talking. That evening, Charlie sat on his porch again, his small radio playing a soft jazz station in the background. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the quiet street. He held his mug of tea between his hands, its warmth a welcome contrast to the evening chill. He heard footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. Turning his head, he saw Lydia walking up the path, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. She looked nervous but determined. "Evening, Mr. Thompson," she said softly when she reached the porch. Charlie set his mug down, surprised to see her. "Evening, Lydia. What brings you all the way out here?" She hesitated for a moment, her eyes dropping to the ground before looking back up. "I wanted to check on you. After yesterday—" Her voice trailed off, and she swallowed hard. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay." Charlie studied her carefully. There was no pity in her eyes, only genuine concern. "I'm fine," he said with a small nod. "Thank you for coming." Lydia stepped closer, shifting her weight awkwardly. "I've been telling people what happened. What Bennett did. I couldn't stay quiet about it. It wasn't right." Charlie's brows lifted slightly. "You've been telling people?" She nodded quickly. "Yeah, James, too. He's been talking to folks around town. It's not much, but—" Charlie let out a slow breath, his gaze softening. "It's something." Lydia looked at him, her voice earnest now. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner, Mr. Thompson. I was scared, I guess, but seeing how you handled it, how you stayed calm even when—" She stopped, shaking her head. "It stuck with me." Charlie was quiet for a long moment. Then he gave her a small, reassuring smile. "It's not easy to speak up, Lydia. It takes courage, but you're doing the right thing." Lydia's shoulders relaxed slightly, and for the first time she smiled back. "Well, I just wanted you to know that people care. You're not alone." Charlie's chest tightened, the words settling into him like a balm on an old wound. "You're not alone." It had been so long since he'd heard those words spoken with sincerity. "Thank you," he said softly. "That means a lot." Lydia nodded and turned to leave, her footsteps light against the gravel. Charlie watched her go, his heart heavy but somehow lighter at the same time. He thought of James's visit the day before, of Lydia's quiet bravery now. It was easy to focus on the ugliness in the world, but moments like this reminded him that kindness existed too small, simple, and often unexpected, but powerful enough to push back against the dark. For so many years, Charlie had believed that nothing would change. He had seen too much and lived through too many disappointments to hope for anything different. But now, for the first time in a long while, he wondered if maybe he had been wrong. Maybe change didn't always come in sweeping gestures or grand victories. Maybe it came in whispers, in small voices choosing to speak up, one at a time. As the sun disappeared behind the horizon, Charlie picked up his mug again, the tea now cold, but still comforting. He stared out into the quiet street and let himself believe just for a moment that things could get better. The morning was bright and clear, a sharp contrast to the heavy tension that hung in the air around town. Word of what had happened to Charlie had spread further than anyone expected. Conversations buzzed in hushed voices on porches, in shops, and between neighbors leaning over fences. Some people were outraged, others uncomfortable, and a few openly dismissive. At the diner, things felt different. Lydia moved quickly behind the counter, her presence more noticeable than usual. People's gazes would occasionally flick to the corner table where Charlie used to sit. The seat was empty now, and its absence had become a silent reminder of the previous day. James O'Connor walked in just as he had every morning, but today there was an edge to his presence. He ordered his usual coffee and sat at the counter. This time, though, he wasn't alone. Tom Simmons, the retired factory worker, joined him, sliding onto the stool next to James. He nodded to Lydia in greeting before leaning close to James. "Been hearing your name come up all over town," Tom said in a low voice. James sipped his coffee. "That so?" "Yeah," Tom muttered. "Some folks don't like all this talking. Think we're stirring up trouble." James glanced at him, his expression hardening. "Let them think what they want. Staying quiet's what let this happen in the first place." Tom nodded slowly, his face thoughtful. "I just wanted you to know you're not alone in this. A lot of us think it's about time someone said something." Lydia, overhearing, felt her heart swell. She hadn't realized how far her words and James's quiet determination had spread. For the first time in a long while, it felt like the silence that usually suffocated this town was breaking apart. The doorbell chimed, and Officer Ryan Bennett stepped inside. The room tensed as if the air itself had frozen. Bennett's boots thudded against the linoleum as he walked to the counter, his gaze briefly flicking toward James and Tom. His expression was as hard as ever, but there was something else there now, something defensive, almost wary. "Morning, Lydia," Bennett said, his tone too casual as he stood at the counter. "Morning," Lydia replied flatly, not bothering to mask the iciness in her voice. Bennett leaned on the counter, giving James a pointed look. "Heard you've been running your mouth all over town." James turned slowly, his gaze meeting Bennett's with quiet steel. "It's not running my mouth, Bennett. It's telling the truth." Bennett let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You think you know what happened? You weren't even there." "I know enough," James replied calmly. "Enough to know you crossed a line." Bennett's jaw tightened, his face turning red. "You don't know anything about what I've done or why I did it. That man was disrespectful and refused to leave when I told him to. I did my job." "Your job?" James asked, his voice dangerously soft. "You think it's your job to humiliate a man who's done nothing but sit and wait for his son? You think it's your job to treat a veteran like he's beneath you?" Bennett's fists curled at his sides, his voice growing harsh. "Watch yourself, O'Connor. You don't know what you're talking about." Tom cut in before things could escalate further. "No, I think we all know exactly what happened," he said, his voice steady. "You think you're untouchable because of that badge, but that's not how this works. Not anymore." Bennett turned his glare on Tom, but Tom didn't flinch. Around the diner, other patrons were listening now, some pretending not to, while others stared openly. Lydia's hand gripped the coffee pot tightly, her pulse racing as she watched the scene unfold. Bennett pushed off the counter, his voice low. "You all think you're so high and mighty, spreading rumors, stirring the pot. But you'll see this town doesn't care about some old man and his sob story." The words hit Lydia like a slap, but before she could respond, James spoke again, his voice calm but resolute. "This town cares more than you think, Bennett, and you're going to find out just how much." Bennett sneered, shaking his head as he turned and stormed out of the diner. The bell above the door rang sharply, the sound lingering in the silence he left behind. James turned back to his coffee, his hands steady as he picked up the cup. "Cowards always get loud when they know they're losing," he muttered. Tom grunted in agreement. "He'll dig his own grave if he keeps talking like that." Lydia set the coffee pot down, her hands still trembling slightly. "Do you think he'll face any consequences?" she asked quietly. James nodded. "David will make sure of it. That boy's got more backbone than most men I know. Charlie raised him right. Tom added. The three of them sat quietly for a moment, the weight of the conversation lingering. Lydia looked out the window, where the sky had turned a soft, pale blue. She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time, she felt like things were moving in the right direction. Meanwhile, at the police station, David Thompson sat behind his desk, poring over paperwork with his brow furrowed. The internal investigation into Officer Bennett had begun. David had spent the morning gathering witness statements from the diner, Lydia, James, and even a young man who had been sitting near the window that day. Each statement painted the same picture. Charlie had been calm, patient, and quiet. Bennett, on the other hand, had been hostile, aggressive, and unprovoked. David leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Officers like Bennett were often shielded by silence by a system that looked the other way when lines were crossed. But David couldn't look the other way. Not when it was his own father who had been wronged. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Sergeant Harris, a senior officer in the department, standing in the doorway. Harris was a man of few words, but respected by everyone on the force. "Got a minute?" Harris asked. David nodded, motioning for him to come in. Harris stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I hear you're pushing for a full investigation into Bennett," Harris said, his voice neutral. David met his gaze. "That's right." Harris studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good. It's about time someone did." David blinked, surprised. "You agree?" Harris sighed, crossing his arms. "Bennett's been a problem for a long time. People see it, but nobody wants to rock the boat. It's easier to ignore it." He paused, his expression softening. "But what he did to your father, that crossed a line. You're doing the right thing, Captain." David felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For so long, it had felt like he was pushing uphill alone. Knowing he had support, even from someone like Harris, meant more than he cared to admit. "Thanks, Sergeant," David said quietly. Harris nodded. "Keep pushing. People are paying attention now." As Harris left the office, David leaned back in his chair, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just about his father anymore. It was about accountability, about doing what was right, even when it wasn't easy. He wouldn't stop until justice was served. That evening, Charlie sat on his porch again, the fading light casting long shadows across the street. He looked up when he heard footsteps approaching and saw James walking up the path, a small smile on his face. "Evening," James said, settling onto the step beside Charlie. "Evening," Charlie replied, his voice calm. James glanced at him. "Word spreading. People are talking." Charlie nodded slowly. "Good." James leaned back, letting out a satisfied sigh. "You know, it's not easy getting people to see the truth. But once they do, there's no stopping it." Charlie looked out at the quiet street, his voice low but steady. "It's not just about me. It's about making sure the next man doesn't have to face the same thing." James nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "You've got more folks behind you than you think, Charlie. People are finally starting to see what's right." Charlie didn't respond right away, but a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in years, he felt something he had long given up on. Hope. The morning air carried a chill as Charlie stood by the window, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. Sunlight spilled through the glass, casting a soft golden glow on the old table and its few belongings. A newspaper, his veteran ID, and Lydia's napkin note carefully folded and set beside the cup. He glanced outside, watching the world stir to life. A young boy pedaled his bike down the sidewalk, his laughter echoing faintly. A woman jogged past, her breath clouding in the cold air. From where he stood, everything looked quiet, peaceful, yet Charlie knew better. Beneath the surface, this town was buzzing. The news had spread like wildfire. What happened at the diner, Officer Bennett's behavior, The quiet strength with which Charlie had endured it. People were talking. Some defended Bennett, unwilling to see the truth. Others were angry, disgusted by his abuse of power. And some, Charlie thought, simply didn't know what to believe. Still, it was more than he had ever expected. For years, he had kept his head down, his voice low, his presence small. Do not give them a reason to look your way. It had been a lesson he learned young and carried into adulthood, through his military service and beyond. Yet now, for the first time, something was different. People were looking. People were speaking. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Charlie set down his mug and moved toward it, his knees aching slightly from the cold. When he opened it, he found David standing there, still dressed in his uniform. "Morning, Dad," David said, his voice calm but serious. "Morning, son," Charlie replied, stepping aside to let him in. David walked in and sat at the small table, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for something to say. Charlie poured him a cup of tea without asking. They'd done this enough time over the years that no words were needed. Finally, David spoke, his voice steady. "The investigation is moving forward." Charlie raised an eyebrow, settling into the chair across from him. "That's so?" David nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "It's slow. People are watching, waiting to see what happens, but Sergeant Harris and Internal Affairs are on it now. They've collected statements from Lydia, James, and a couple of other folks who were in the diner that day." Charlie studied his son carefully. He could hear the frustration lurking just beneath David's calm exterior. "And Bennett?" David exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "They've put him on administrative leave while the investigation runs its course. He's not happy about it. I saw him at the station yesterday. His attitude hasn't changed." Charlie shook his head slightly. "Men like that don't change overnight. They've got to be made to see." David's eyes met his father's. "That's what I'm trying to do. But it's not easy, Dad. Some of the guys at the station think I'm overstepping. I hear them talking behind my back, saying I'm stirring up trouble." Charlie leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "The truth always stirs up trouble. Doesn't mean it isn't worth telling." David's face softened, and for a moment, he looked younger, like the boy Charlie had raised, full of questions and fire. "You're right. I just don't want to let you down." "You couldn't if you tried," Charlie said quietly. They sat in silence for a moment, sipping their tea. Charlie could see the burden David was carrying, the weight of doing what was right in the face of resistance. He knew how hard that was. He had lived it. Finally, David stood, setting his empty mug back on the table. "I'll be back later, Dad. I just wanted to let you know what's happening." Charlie nodded, his gaze steady. "Take care of yourself out there, son. Don't let them get to you." David offered him a faint smile before turning and heading for the door. As it closed behind him, Charlie let out a quiet breath, his thoughts swirling. That same afternoon, the diner was unusually busy. Lydia moved from table to table, pouring coffee and refilling orders. The conversations floating through the air were quieter than usual, with people speaking in low tones. Word of Bennett's administrative leave had gotten out, and opinions were divided. At a booth near the window, James O'Connor sat with Tom Simmons and a couple of other old-timers who had gathered to talk. They spoke in hushed voices, their expressions serious. "This whole thing's got people riled up," Tom muttered, stirring sugar into his coffee. "I heard Bennett's been running his mouth all over town. Says he's being set up." James scoffed, shaking his head. "That man's too proud to admit he did something wrong. He's clinging to his badge like it's going to save him." One of the other men frowned. "You think he'll get fired?" James set his mug down firmly. "I think it depends on us. People need to keep speaking up. If we stop now, he'll just walk away from this like nothing happened." Lydia overheard the conversation as she passed by, and her heart gave a small flutter of hope. James was right. The more people spoke, the harder it would be for anyone to look away. As the afternoon wore on, The doorbell chimed, and the room fell briefly silent as Officer Bennett stepped inside. He was dressed in plain clothes, but his presence filled the room like a dark cloud. Bennett scanned the diner, his gaze locking onto Lydia. He walked straight to the counter, his boots thudding heavily against the floor. "Lydia," he said, his voice low. She looked up, her heart pounding, but she kept her face calm. "What can I do for you, officer?" He leaned against the counter, his expression cold. "You've been talking about me, to people who have no business sticking their noses where they don't belong." Lydia's hands clenched at her sides, but she held his gaze. "I told the truth." Bennett's jaw tightened. "You think you're helping? You think people like him deserve your sympathy?" Lydia's voice trembled slightly, but her words were firm. "People like him. He's a better man than you'll ever be." The diner had gone silent now, all eyes fixed on the exchange. James stood from his booth, his presence unmistakable as he stepped closer. "Bennett," James said evenly, "I think it's time you left." Bennett's eyes flicked to James, his face reddening. For a moment, it looked like he might argue, but something in James's steady gaze made him hesitate. With a sneer, Bennett turned and stormed out of the diner, the bell above the door clanging harshly. The room exhaled as he left, and Lydia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. James walked up to the counter, his expression softening. "You okay?" Lydia nodded, though her hands still trembled. "Yeah. Thanks, James." He gave her a small smile. "You handled yourself just fine." Around the diner, people began talking again louder now, braver. What had been a ripple was starting to feel like a wave. That evening, David sat in his office, reviewing the statements once again. Each one painted a clear picture of what had happened at the diner. Officer Bennett had acted with hostility and abuse, and no one could deny it. A knock at his door made him look up. Sergeant Harris stepped inside, a stack of papers in his hand. "Captain, Internal Affairs sent over their preliminary findings." David's heart thudded as he took the papers. He flipped through the pages, reading the summary aloud. "Officer Ryan Bennett violated department conduct policies and exhibited unprovoked aggression during the incident." Harris nodded. "They're recommending disciplinary action. This isn't over yet, but it's a start." David let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing slightly. "It's a start," he repeated. He thought of his father, sitting quietly at home, waiting for change he had fought so hard to believe in. Maybe, just maybe, they were getting there. The morning sunlight poured through the blinds of Charlie's small apartment, casting faint lines across the wooden floor. He sat in his armchair, holding a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Outside, the town stirred to life, cars humming past, the faint laughter of children on their way to school. But inside, the room felt still, quiet, and thoughtful. Charlie stared at the newspaper on his lap. Though he had yet to read it, he already knew what it would say. The past few days had brought a strange energy to the town, whispers growing louder, small ripples turning into waves. Conversations had started on porches, in barbershops, and at the diner, where people who once said nothing were beginning to say something. But change, Charlie knew, was slow. It had always been slow. A sharp knock on the door broke through his thoughts. Charlie set the paper down and rose to his feet, his knees groaning from the effort. When he opened the door, David stood there, dressed in his uniform, his posture formal, but his face softer than usual. "Morning, Dad," David said, his voice steady. "Morning, son." Charlie stepped back, motioning for him to come inside. David entered, his boots clicking softly against the floor. He held a thin folder in his hand, gripping it like it carried the weight of the world. He sat at the kitchen table, setting the folder down and exhaling slowly, as if gathering his thoughts. Charlie followed, easing himself into the chair across from his son. "What's going on?" Charlie asked, his gaze sharp. David hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words. Bennett had his hearing this morning. Charlie's brow lifted slightly, though his face remained calm. And, David's jaw tightened, the Department Internal Affairs, they ruled against him. He pushed the folder forward. He's being terminated, effective immediately. Charlie looked down at the folder, but didn't touch it. Instead, he studied his son's face. So, it's done? David let out a slow breath. It's not done, but it's a step. Bennett won't be wearing the badge anymore. For a long moment, the room was silent. Charlie stared at the folder as if it were something fragile, something that might vanish if he looked too hard. Finally, he nodded, his voice quiet but firm. Good. David leaned back in his chair, watching his father carefully. You okay? Charlie looked up, meeting his son's eyes. I'm fine, David. He paused, his expression thoughtful. I'm proud of you, you know, for seeing this through. David's face softened, a flicker of emotion breaking through his usual composure. I couldn't let him get away with it, Dad. Not after what he did to you. Charlie nodded, his gaze distant now. It wasn't just about me, son. Men like him, they get away with it because people let them. You didn't let him. That's what matters. David sighed, running a hand over the back of his neck. Not everyone sees it that way. Some of the guys at the station are angry. They think I threw one of our own under the bus. Charlie's expression hardened slightly. Bennett threw himself under the bus. You just made sure no one looked the other way. David smiled faintly, though the weight of the situation lingered in his posture. I wish it were that simple. It never is, Charlie said quietly. But the right thing usually isn't simple. David nodded, letting the words settle. Across town, the police station sat under an unusually bright sky. Officers moved through the hallways, their footsteps muted against the tile floors. A sense of unease hung in the air, something unspoken, but felt by everyone. In the conference room, Officer Ryan Bennett sat at the long table, his posture stiff and his expression dark. Across from him, a representative from Internal Affairs read through the findings of their investigation. David stood in the back of the room, his arms crossed, his face calm but unyielding. Officer Bennett, the representative said, her tone formal. Based on witness statements, departmental policies, and the evidence presented, this board finds that your actions during the incident at the diner were in direct violation of your oath and responsibilities as an officer of this department. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated. Bennett's jaw clenched, his face turning red. This is a mistake, he snapped. I was doing my job. No, the representative replied sharply. You abused your authority, and now you're facing the consequences of your actions. Bennett's gaze flicked toward David, his expression hardening. This is on you, he growled, his voice low but venomous. You did this to me. David didn't flinch. He stared back, calm and resolute. No, Bennett, you did this to yourself. Bennett pushed back his chair abruptly, the screech of metal against tile making everyone in the room wince. He stood there for a moment, his fists curled at his sides, before turning and storming out of the room without another word. As the door slammed shut behind him, the room exhaled. That afternoon, word of Bennett's termination spread quickly. Some were angry, some relieved, and others quietly hopeful. The small town had never felt louder, even though most of the noise was unspoken, a collective shift that seemed to ripple through its streets. At the diner, Lydia stood behind the counter, wiping down a coffee cup as the bell above the door chimed. She looked up to see James O'Connor walk in, his usual gruff expression softening as he nodded to her. Afternoon, James, Lydia said, offering him a smile. Afternoon, he replied, settling onto his usual stool. Heard the news? Lydia's brow lifted slightly. About Bennett? James nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Yeah, Looks like the right folks finally stepped up. Lydia's smile widened, and she poured him a fresh cup of coffee. It's about time, isn't it? Sure is, James replied. He glanced toward the empty corner table where Charlie used to sit. Has he been back? Lydia shook her head. Not yet, but I hope he comes back soon. James sipped his coffee, his gaze distant but thoughtful. He will, he said quietly. Men like Charlie, men with that kind of dignity, they don't stay away for long. That evening, Charlie sat on his porch again, the faint glow of the setting sun warming the wooden steps beneath his feet. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that brought a sense of peace rather than isolation. When he looked up, he saw David walking up the path, his posture less rigid than it had been that morning. In his hands was a small brown bag and a thermos of coffee. Figured I'd bring you dinner, David said, holding up the bag. Charlie smiled faintly, motioning for him to sit. Appreciate it, son. David settled onto the step beside him, setting the bag down between them. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, watching the light fade behind the rooftops. Bennett's gone, David said finally, his voice soft. Charlie nodded. I heard. David turned to look at him. How do you feel about it? Charlie took a long breath, his gaze steady. Like there's a long way to go, he admitted, but it's a start. David smiled faintly, nodding. Yeah, it's a start. Charlie looked at his son, pride shining in his eyes. You did good, David. You didn't let it slide. That's how things change, one step at a time. David's smile grew, his shoulders relaxing, as if a weight had been lifted. You're right, Dad. The two men sat together as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Charlie knew there would always be men like Bennett, men who wielded their power like a weapon. But he also knew there were people like David, Lydia, and James, people who spoke up, who refused to stay silent, who chose kindness over fear. And for the first time in a long while, Charlie let himself believe that the world could change. The next morning, the town felt different. It was subtle, like the feeling in the air after a storm, when the clouds had broken and the sun peeked through, but it was there. Word of Officer Bennett's termination had traveled faster than the wind, settling into every corner of the town. Some were relieved, others resentful, but no one could deny that something had shifted. At his small kitchen table, Charlie sat with a newspaper unfolded in front of him. The headline was clear and simple. Officer Bennett dismissed following misconduct investigation. Beneath it, a few paragraphs outlined the details: witness statements, departmental findings, and the official decision that Bennett had crossed a line. Charlie read it twice, his expression calm but thoughtful. He set the paper aside, reaching for his coffee. It wasn't joy he felt, not exactly. There was no victory in seeing someone lose their livelihood, no matter how much they might have deserved it. But there was relief, a quiet assurance that the world still had room for justice. A knock at the door broke his reverie. Charlie stood, moving slowly toward the sound. When he opened it, he found James O'Connor standing there, a small smile on his weathered face. In his hands, he held 2 paper cups of coffee and a white paper bag that smelled faintly of breakfast. "Morning, Charlie," James said. "Morning," Charlie replied, stepping back to let him in. James handed him one of the cups and set the bag on the table. "Figured you could use some company this morning. Thought I'd bring breakfast." Charlie gave him a knowing look, but nodded. "I appreciate that." The two men settled at the table, steam curling up from their coffee cups as the smell of bacon and eggs filled the small room. Charlie unwrapped a sandwich, taking a bite as James sipped his coffee. After a moment, James spoke, his tone casual but deliberate. "You see the paper?" Charlie nodded, gesturing toward the folded newspaper. "I did." James glanced at it, his expression unreadable. "Lot of folks are talking. Not all of them are happy about what happened to Bennett." Charlie looked at him. "There's always going to be some who don't want to see the truth." True, James said. He leaned back slightly, his fingers wrapped around the coffee cup. But there's more people speaking up now than I've seen in a long time. People like Lydia, like Tom Simmons. Hell, even the younger folks are getting involved. Charlie's brow lifted slightly. That right? James nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Yeah. Lydia's been organizing a small gathering over at the diner. She says it's to recognize you, to make sure folks understand what happened and why it matters. Charlie froze, the sandwich halfway to his mouth. What? James chuckled softly. You heard me. She wants you to come, Charlie. Says it's important for people to see you there to hear your story. To understand that what happened isn't just about one man's bad decisions. Charlie frowned, setting his sandwich down. I don't know about that, James. I'm not looking for attention. James's smile faded, his expression turning serious. It's not about attention, Charlie. It's about showing people that they don't have to stay quiet. You sat there in that diner, minding your business, and you got treated like you didn't belong. That's not just your story. That's a story too many people know. But now, folks like Lydia are trying to make it mean something. Charlie stared at his coffee, the steam rising in thin curls. He understood what James was saying, but the thought of standing in front of a crowd of people looking at him, expecting something, made him uneasy. I don't know, Charlie said quietly. What good does it do, James? The people who need to hear it won't listen. James shook his head. That's not true. Some of them won't, but others will. And the ones who do, that's where change starts. The words settled between them, heavy and honest. Charlie looked at the older man across the table and saw something in his eyes, a quiet determination that mirrored his own. James had lived a life not so different from his, had seen the same struggles, carried the same burdens, and yet here he was, showing up again and again, refusing to let the silence win. Finally, Charlie sighed, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You're a stubborn man, James. James grinned. Takes one to know one. Charlie shook his head, but didn't argue. That afternoon, the diner hummed with quiet anticipation. The usual clatter of silverware and low conversation filled the room, but there was something else in the air, something unspoken, but shared. Lydia moved quickly behind the counter, her movements brisk but focused. She had spent the past few days organizing this gathering, calling people, sharing the story, encouraging others to show up. It wasn't about pointing fingers or stoking anger. It was about recognizing Charlie, about showing him that he wasn't alone. The doorbell chimed, and Lydia looked up just as James entered, followed closely by Charlie. A hush fell over the room as people turned to look, conversations faltering mid-sentence. Charlie hesitated for half a second, his shoulders instinctively stiffening under the weight of so many eyes. But James patted him on the back, a quiet gesture of encouragement, and Charlie squared his shoulders, walking deeper into the room. Lydia smiled warmly as she stepped forward to greet them. Mr. Thompson, she said softly, I'm so glad you came. Afternoon, Lydia, Charlie replied, his voice steady. James guided him to a table near the front, where a few familiar faces waited. Tom Simmons, a couple of veterans Charlie recognized, and even a few young men and women who had started to pay attention. Lydia moved to the center of the room, clearing her throat. Everyone, she said, her voice carrying over the quiet, thank you for coming. The small crowd settled, all eyes on her. Lydia took a breath, her hands trembling slightly, but she pushed through. Most of you have heard what happened last week. What happened to Mr. Thompson? She glanced at Charlie, who met her gaze calmly. But this isn't just about what happened to one man. It's about what we allow to happen in this town, what we choose to speak up about, and what we choose to ignore. A ripple of murmurs swept through the room, but Lydia continued. Mr. Thompson has lived here quietly for years. He served this country, worked hard, raised a family, and yet he was treated like he didn't belong. That's not right. The room fell silent again, her words sinking in. Today is about recognizing that, Lydia said softly. And it's about taking the first step toward being better, toward speaking up when something isn't right. She turned to Charlie, her voice gentle. Mr. Thompson, would you like to say anything? Charlie's heart thudded in his chest. For a moment, he thought about shaking his head, about letting the silence swallow the moment. But then he saw the faces around him. James, Lydia, Tom, and so many others who had shown up. People who had chosen to care, to stand with him instead of looking the other way. He rose slowly to his feet, his hands steady at his sides. The room quieted again, all eyes turning to him. Charlie cleared his throat, his voice low but clear. I never asked for any of this, he said simply. All I wanted was to sit and wait for my son, to have a cup of coffee like anyone else. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. But what happened wasn't just about me. It's about all the times people have been made to feel like they don't belong, like they aren't welcome. That's something no one should have to feel. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. I've seen a lot in my time, Charlie continued, and I've learned that change doesn't happen overnight. But it does happen when people choose to do the right thing, even when it's hard. He looked at Lydia, at James, at all the faces watching him. You all being here today, that means something. It's a start. Charlie nodded, then slowly sat back down. The room was silent for a moment, as if holding its breath. Then, one by one, people started to clap. It was hesitant at first, but it grew louder, steadier, until the entire diner was filled with applause. Lydia smiled, tears shining in her eyes. James grinned, clapping hard enough to rattle the table. Even Tom, usually reserved, joined in with quiet pride. Charlie sat quietly, his face calm, but his heart full. For the first time in a long while, he felt something stirred deep inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. The days following the gathering at the diner passed quietly, but something in the town felt different now. It was subtle, like the first signs of spring after a long, bitter winter. People greeted each other with softer voices, their smiles a little less cautious, their eyes meeting without hesitation. The air seemed clearer, less weighed down by the silence that had held so many backs for so long. At Charlie's small apartment, the sunlight streamed through the window, catching the edges of the few belongings that defined his life. The framed flag on the mantel gleamed faintly in the morning light, the picture of his late wife beside it, as steady and comforting as ever. A small stack of letters sat unopened on the table, but this time they weren't bills. Most were handwritten notes of apology, kindness, and gratitude. Charlie sat in his armchair, holding a card Lydia had dropped off earlier that morning. Her words were simple but heartfelt. Thank you for showing us what courage looks like. You've given us all something to stand for. He set the card down carefully, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. For years, he had walked through life without expecting much from the world. He had learned long ago to keep his head down, to endure, to survive. But now, for the first time in a long time, he felt seen. Not as a man in the corner, not as someone to dismiss or ignore, but as himself, Charles Thompson. A sudden knock at the door made him pause. He rose slowly, his knees protesting, and opened it to find David standing there, with his hands tucked into his coat pockets. "Morning, Dad," David said, offering a small, easy smile. "Morning, son," Charlie replied. "You're here early." David shrugged, stepping inside and removing his coat. "Thought I'd take you somewhere." Charlie raised an eyebrow. "Where's that?" "You'll see," David said, the hint of a grin on his face. Charlie gave him a long look, but didn't argue. He reached for his worn coat, pulling it on and buttoning it carefully. When he turned, David was watching him with a quiet pride that softened the edges of his usual seriousness. "Ready?" David asked. Charlie nodded. "Lead the way." The car ride was quiet but comfortable. The streets rolled past them, small houses with sagging porches, shop windows filled with displays that hadn't changed in years. Charlie watched the town through the car window, noticing the details he had grown used to ignoring. A boy tossing a football with his father on the lawn, an older couple walking hand in hand down the sidewalk, a man on a ladder painting over graffiti on the side of a building. The world looked the same, and yet something about it felt different. David pulled the car into a familiar parking lot, and Charlie's brow furrowed as he looked through the windshield. It was the diner. The same checkered floors, the same red signs still faded and chipped, but somehow brighter in the clear morning light. "What are we doing here?" Charlie asked, his voice measured. David turned off the engine, turning to look at his father. "You haven't been back since that day, have you?" Charlie glanced out the window again, the empty booth in the far corner catching his eye. "No, I haven't." David's voice softened. "It's time you went back, Dad. You belong here just as much as anyone else." Charlie let the words settle for a moment, his gaze still fixed on the diner. "I don't know, David," he said quietly. "I'm not sure it's that simple." David reached over and rested a hand on his father's shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "It is that simple. You sat in that booth and waited for me, just like anyone else. You didn't do anything wrong. That's what matters." Charlie turned to look at his son, the pride and conviction in David's eyes stirring something deep inside him. For so many years, Charlie had carried the weight of being dismissed, ignored, and unwelcome. And yet here was his son standing tall, standing proud, reminding him that the weight wasn't his to carry. "All right," Charlie said finally, his voice steady. "Let's go in." The bell above the door chimed softly as Charlie and David stepped inside the diner. The warm smell of coffee and bacon greeted them, familiar and comforting. A few heads turned, and for a moment there was a hush, a stillness that seemed to hang in the air. Lydia looked up from behind the counter, her face breaking into a wide smile as she saw them. "Mr. Thompson," she said warmly, stepping out from behind the counter. "Welcome back." Charlie nodded at her, offering a small, polite smile. "Morning, Lydia." "Have a seat anywhere," Lydia said, gesturing to the tables. "Coffee's on the house." David motioned to the corner booth, the same one Charlie had sat in that day. Charlie hesitated only briefly before walking over, lowering himself into the seat. It felt strange at first returning to a place that held such a bitter memory, but something about it also felt right. David slid into the booth across from him, a small, proud smile on his face. Lydia appeared a moment later, setting 2 mugs of steaming coffee on the table. "It's good to see you here," she said softly, her gaze lingering on Charlie for just a moment before she turned back toward the counter. Charlie wrapped his hands around the mug, letting its warmth settle into his palms. He looked around the diner, his eyes catching on familiar faces. Tom Simmons gave him a small wave from a nearby table. James O'Connor nodded at him from his usual spot at the counter. A young couple who had witnessed the incident smiled hesitantly before turning back to their conversation. No one looked away. No one sneered or stared with suspicion. For the first time, Charlie felt like he wasn't just occupying space, he was part of it. "This is how it should be," David said quietly, breaking the silence. "You sitting here, having your coffee, just like anyone else." Charlie looked at his son, a faint smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "You know, I wasn't sure I'd come back here." David leaned back, his expression soft. "But you did. That's what matters." Charlie looked down at his coffee, the steam rising in delicate curls. "The world's slow to change," he said finally, his voice low. "But sometimes all it takes is a push in the right direction." David nodded. "Yeah, and people willing to do the pushing." Charlie's smile widened slightly. He looked around the diner once more, taking in the small but meaningful changes. Lydia moving with more confidence behind the counter, James sitting at his stool, unbothered and unafraid, conversations carrying on, but quieter now, kinder, more aware. It wasn't everything, Charlie thought. There were still people who wouldn't change, still corners of the world where men like Officer Bennett thrived. But here, in this small diner on a quiet street, something had shifted. It was enough. As Charlie sipped his coffee, he thought about all the moments that had led to this one, the cruelty, the silence, the unexpected kindness. Each small act had mattered. Each small voice had carried weight. For years he had believed that he didn't belong, that his place was in the background, quiet and unseen. But now, sitting in this booth with his son across from him, Charlie knew the truth. He belonged here. He always had. The bell above the door chimed softly again as new customers entered, the sounds of life carrying on as they always did. Outside, the sun climbed higher in the sky, bathing the town in light. And inside the diner, in the corner booth by the window, Charlie sat with his coffee, his shoulders relaxed, his presence undeniable. For the first time in a long while, Charles Thompson felt at peace. The diner remained a place where time seemed to stand still. But for Charlie, the meaning of that small corner booth had changed forever. People continued to come and go, sipping their coffee and sharing quiet conversations. But now, Charlie wasn't just another forgotten face. He was seen. In the days that followed, life carried on, as it always did. But something lingered, a lesson, a ripple of change that spread further than any of them could see. Lydia continued serving coffee with a little more confidence, her kindness unwavering. James still sat at the counter, a steady presence who reminded others to speak up when it mattered. And David, resolute in his integrity, continued to lead his department with fairness and respect, knowing the cost of silence was always too high. As for Charlie, he visited the diner more often now. Some mornings he sat alone, enjoying the warmth of his coffee as the sun streamed through the window. Other days, James joined him, and they shared quiet conversations about the past, about what it meant to stand tall in a world that tried to make you small. One thing was certain: Charlie Thompson belonged here, in this town, in that booth, in this life he had earned. And he would never let anyone take that from him again. Thank you for watching this story of perseverance, kindness, and quiet courage. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to our channel for more content that inspires hope, sparks conversation, and reminds us all of the power of standing up for what's right. Don't forget to like this video, share it with others who need to hear this message, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Together, we can create a world where small acts of kindness and courage lead to lasting change. Thank you for being here. Until next time, take care and keep spreading kindness.